biodiversity offsetting is done as the final step of the mitigation hierarchy to balance a loss from a development project, like a new mine or highway, with a gain elsewhere. The gain usually needs to be of the same type of biodiversity and should achieve at least no net loss of biodiversity. Let's have a look at an example of how offsetting is frequently done. Say we have 80 hectares of forest in a particular landscape, of which 20 hectares are lost to a new development, in this case, a power line project. Given other pressures in the landscape, we think it is quite likely in the future that more of this forest might be lost. If the protection of the remaining 60 hectares as an offset for the power line project prevented the future loss of at least 20 of those hectares, we could claim this as an example of no net loss, relative to what might otherwise have happened. This is called averted loss offsetting. However, and this is a crucial point, the overall outcome is that we have 20 hectares less forest in the landscape compared to before the project and offset occurred. This type of offsetting does not result in absolute gains to biodiversity. It just prevents further losses and thus reduces rates of decline. Also, it is usually done on a project-by-project basis, without regard to the biodiversity outcomes across the broader landscape. For these reasons, it does not lend itself well to the achievement of broader conservation goals that nations might set, like a target to retain forest at its current amount into the future, or to increase the population of a particular threatened species to a certain number of individuals. There is an increasing expectation of governments to set ambitious conservation goals, but current offset designs, like relative no net loss, will rarely contribute to these targets being met. So, how can we adapt offsetting to be better aligned with biodiversity conservation goals? Target-based ecological compensation might be the answer. The first step is to identify what the relevant targets are for the particular biodiversity features of interest. This isn't always simple, but often biodiversity strategies can provide a starting point. Once the target outcomes for biodiversity are clear, then for each biodiversity feature potentially affected by a development, we need to assess whether it is at, above, or below its target level. This allows us to determine whether the compensation for a loss to a specific biodiversity feature requires an absolute outcome of net gain, no net loss, or whether some managed losses might be acceptable. For example, if a biodiversity feature that is affected by a project is below its target, then the compensation must achieve a net gain in that biodiversity feature, in absolute, not relative terms. So, if achieving a target required an increase of twice the current extent of habitat for a particular threatened species, and a project resulted in the loss of 100 hectares of that species' habitat, appropriate compensation would be to provide 200 hectares of new habitat through restoration or improvement of habitat. In other cases where a biodiversity feature, like an arid zone ecosystem, is widespread and common, some losses might be acceptable, but compensation can be designed to limit the amount of loss so that a target amount of that ecosystem is retained and protected. This could be provided by protecting enough hectares of that ecosystem for each hectare lost, so that if all of the remaining ecosystem was either lost or protected, the target retention level is not breached. This is called a managed net loss. Crucially, once the ecosystem retention target is reached, no further net losses to that ecosystem are acceptable, and any losses must be compensated for with equivalent gains. This target-based approach to ecological compensation has several advantages. First, residual biodiversity losses can be compensated for in a way that contributes proportionally to the achievement of a jurisdiction's biodiversity targets. Second, The type and amount of compensation required for a particular loss are clearly defined, and so requirements for developers and outcomes for stakeholders are clear and consistent. And third, compensation requirements are aligned with the desired trajectory for a particular species or ecosystem across a region or nation, depending on what needs to occur to achieve the target for that feature. Where policies relating to impact assessment or application of the mitigation hierarchy are being developed or updated, target-based ecological compensation may be an appropriate and more user-friendly alternative to biodiversity offsetting.